When Motorola brought back the Razr a few years ago, there was a lot of excitement, undoubtedly fueled by nostalgic memories of the original, which, in its day, was one of the most popular phones in the world. But then, after releasing a 5G-enabled sequel, things got a little bit quiet on the Razr front. Perhaps because in the face of increasingly competitive devices from Samsung, Motorola realized it couldn't rely on nostalgia alone to sell the next version. And so, almost 2 years after the last one, Motorola is back again with another Razr. I'm Cam Bunton from Pocket-lint, and this is our review of the Motorola Razr 2022 edition. If you do like it, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe, and tap the notification bell to make sure you don't miss any more. Now, the first thing I noticed about the Razr was when opened, I could almost forget it's a folding phone. The hinge in its fully open state locks into place to create this completely flat candy bar form. With that, an almost invisible crease on the display, and the fact the display is the same size as a proper flagship Android phone, the experience is very much like using a regular smartphone. It's a big improvement on the internal display from the Razr 5G. The display has increased from 6.2 inches to 6.7 inches, and at 20:9 it's a wider aspect ratio too, giving it a much more expansive feel than its predecessor or even the Galaxy Z Flip 4. That, when combined with the quite thick but even bezels all the way around it, means the phone is wider than its predecessor. In fact, it's wider than most phones, but since it folds in half, the phone is still portable enough to carry around easily in a pocket. And one of the really pleasing things about the Razr is that its hinge design allows it to close almost completely flush. There are no big gaps left in between the halves of the display for dust and pocket fluff to get into. But as much as the hinge improvement is good, it's not perfect. It locks into place well and actually holds the screen at different angles without pulling open or falling shut. However, when you are moving it, it feels a little bit loose and a tiny bit wobbly. It's nowhere near as tight and smooth as a mechanism that we've seen in other manufacturers' phones. This doesn't seem to impact its use negatively, but it doesn't really fill me with a lot of confidence about its longevity. Likewise, if you press a little bit too hard on the middle part of the display where the hinge is, it crackles a little bit. It's rare that this would happen, but it did on the odd occasion that I pressed a little too forcefully on the screen in the wrong place. And then there's the gap on either side of the display between the hinge and the hinge end caps that seems to enjoy collecting particles of dust and fluff too. So again, not perfect, but it is definitely better. Moving on to the external display on the Razr 2022, and it's arguably the one feature that sets it apart from other modern clamshells. It does a lot more than just show you notifications or widgets at a glance. Of course, it can do those things. In fact, it does them better, because the large 2.7-inch size means it can simply fit more on it. So you can, if you like, view and read your notifications, see the weather forecast, or scroll through today's agenda and use it as a camera viewfinder. And this particular feature, the camera viewfinder, is arguably its best reason for existence. If only because it allows you to use the main camera on the front of the phone for taking selfies, rather than using the poorer quality selfie cam inside the phone. In addition, you can also open apps in it. That gives you the ability to open messaging apps, read message threads, and even reply to them using a small on-screen keyboard if you don't want to open the main display. It is worth noting here that not all apps load properly, or are well optimized for this smaller screen, and some aren't supported at all, but we did find it useful to catch up on missed messages quickly, as well as use it as a quick calculator or voice recorder in a pinch. Now, moving on to the main display and the media experience, and there's an inherent downside to flexible displays, and that's the fact that the flexible protective material, whether it be plastic film or ultra-thin glass, or whatever fancy name it comes with, they're generally not as good at resisting reflections and fingerprints as modern real glass panels. It isn't terrible, thankfully, and the screen can be bright enough that for the most part it does cut through even in bright daylight. But I did have to adjust the brightness slider manually quite a lot. The automatic setting was generally too dim a lot of the time and didn't adjust very quickly, even when there wasn't all that much light around. Apart from those minor inconveniences, the display is actually very good. It's bright enough and has deep enough contrast and black levels that it's compatible with HDR10+ content. It also supports up to 1 billion colors, so you get 10-bit color depth, and you get refresh rates up to 144 Hz, but only in certain conditions. By default, its adaptive rate is enabled to go up to 120 Hz in the user interface, but that can be kicked up to 144 if you're playing a game that supports those higher rates. The end result, though, is an experience that feels really fluid and responsive, with animations that instantly kick into gear when you touch and swipe on the display. In other words, it's a great screen. Now, where I was left a little nonplussed was with Moto's conservative approach to optimizations designed for the foldable screen. With the Galaxy Flip as an example, Samsung has created a flex mode. This works in a few different apps so that you can fold the display to an angle and have useful controls for things like video playback in the web browser or shooting tools in Instagram. In fact, for a lot of apps you can set it up to automatically push the important stuff up to the top half of the screen when it's folded upright. With Moto you don't get that same flexibility. With the camera app you do get control buttons on the bottom and the viewfinder pushed up to the top in a so-called tripod view, which is useful, but you don't get hands-free gestures to take a selfie like you do with the Samsung. So you can't just set it down and hold your hand up to snap a pic of yourself. It's like the phone and software was really only designed to be used in its fully open position, which is a little bit of a shame, but thankfully that's how you're going to use it most of the time anyway. Like so many other phones that feature the Snapdragon 8 Plus Gen 1 processor, the performance on the latest Razr is impossible to fault. It's speedy, it can cope with the most demanding games, and the aforementioned hinge improvement means it doesn't matter if you swipe frantically across it, you shouldn't feel it attempting to bend or fold and close. It didn't seem to matter what game we tried on the Motorola, it was quick to load and quick to download any additional data. Gestures on the touchscreen were met with near instant reaction from the animation on screen, at least when it came to gaming. The phone handles any demanding title like a champ, and even after extended gaming sessions we didn't feel it getting overly warm or start to stutter. When you read that a flagship phone with 120 or 144 Hz display has only a 3500 mAh battery, you might assume the battery life is terrible. Except because it's a folding phone, the main display isn't always in use. So the battery life was easily just as good as any standard phone we've tested, with a 4500 or even 5000 mAh battery. It was never a struggle to get to the end of the day, starting at 7:30 and going to bed at about 11 PM. Most days I'd finish with somewhere near 30% left over after 2 or 3 hours of screen time, and it ships with a 30-watt charger too for convenient refills. Moving on to the cameras now, and on paper the dual camera setup on the Razr 2022 should be fine, and in reality it is fine. Perhaps that's a bit cruel because the primary camera is actually quite good, delivering images with a good HDR effect, vibrant color and good contrast. The main camera, capturing images with its 50 megapixel sensor, is able to use all of its pixels to focus, making autofocus quite quick, although it does seem to struggle with moving objects that are close to the lens. Still, apart from the slightly unnatural bokeh or background blur, the images look decent. It is the only good camera on the Razr though, sadly, and the experience of using the system just isn't consistent. Results from the ultra-wide are quite frankly poor. The end images don't have anything close to the same colouring and balance of the primary lens, and it also struggles to capture good detail, with images often coming out very soft, especially with elements like leaves and trees or brickwork. But the advantage of having such a high resolution main sensor is that it can offer relatively effective zoom by cropping into the sensor, so you can push all the way to 8 times, but as you can see the images do look a bit ropey once you get to that extreme end of the zoom length. As for low light performance, it's not a perfect system, but with automatic night mode that comes on as soon as the camera detects low light levels, you can just point and shoot with the main sensor and get a pretty good image. The selfie camera punched into the tiny hole in the main display isn't great. It can take okay selfies, but results are often lacking in detail and over-softened without any depth or colour. It's why we're so glad the screen on the front lets you use the main cameras if you want to, because the difference is quite striking. Word of warning, you will want to disable the automatic beautification, however, since the Motorola phone has it enabled by default, and the over-softened skin that's produced as a result of that is almost cartoon-like. Now, in the end, there is a lot to like about the new Razr. The design and display improvements are very welcome, as is the speedy performance offered by the processor inside. Now, I'd love to see better use of that flexible display in the software, and the ultra-wide camera should be a lot better than it is, but it's much needed competition for Samsung, and with its proper sized screen when it's fully open, it's one that some people might prefer to the smaller, more narrow Samsung phone. Let me know what you think of the new Razr in the comments down below. Would you like me to compare it to the Flip 4? If you did like this video, please do leave a thumbs up, subscribe and tap the notification bell, and I'll see you again in the next one. Bye for now.